Today, this 150-meter giant leaves port to hunt giant halibut, flat-bodied brutes.
Every meter of gear is built for bottom work. Hooks, weights, and lines designed to sit on the seafloor. These baits must be worthy of monsters. Heavy, bloody offerings big enough to make a 5-ton flatfish lift itself off the bottom to eat.
This crane will lift living manhole covers the size of rooms. 5 tons of flexing muscle and bone hauled from the seafloor to the deck.
Far from land, every shackle and clip becomes part of a chain that will reach from this steel deck down to sand and mud hundreds of meters below. Each hook is a promise. If a giant halibut clamps down, the forged steel must hold through every twist and roll. The crew falls into the familiar tempo, building kilometer after kilometer of seafloor highway long before any fish appears. Hooks vanish into the surface chaos and then into the dark, sinking toward a world of cold, pressure, and sand. Electronics sketch the ground they'll never see. Edges and shelves where giant halibut can vanish into sand with a flick of a fin.
As darkness fills the sky, their gear settles onto the seafloor below, lying still among ridges and sand where nothing on the surface can reach.
Dawn topside is when the line starts to come back, bringing news from a world of sand and pressure, hundreds of meters down. Each buoy is a handle to the seafloor. Once locked into the drum, it begins to unwind whatever the night tied on down there.
Most hooks come back as ghosts, empty promises, bitten chunks, traces of meals that never turned into a full encounter.
At first, the haul feels almost boring, just the drag of water and the small weights of missed chances.
Down where light never reaches, the line lies like a thin thread across dunes and ridges, barely noticed by most of what crawls and swims there.
A giant halibut doesn't patrol like a shark. It waits, a living slab of muscle disguised as seafloor.
When scent and vibration finally line up, the halibut's eyes tilt, focusing on a single piece of meat on a line like it's a stray crab.
Scaled to this size, even a simple rise off the bottom is an event, sand exploding underneath as the flat body peels itself from the ground.
The bite is not flashy but absolute, a vacuum grab that swallows bait, hook, and half the water around them in a single draw.
On the screen, mass appears not as shape but as thickness, one patch of bottom that has decided to lift itself toward the hull.
Once hooked, the halibut doesn't sprint. It leans its weight into the line, trying to turn its surface area and mass into an anchor.
On deck, the first sign is a change in vibration. The line's smooth whisper becomes a deeper note under their boots. 5 tons of flatfish turning sideways becomes a storm for anything nearby, the calm bottom exploding into a spinning mess of sand and motion. The line's lean tells them more than any graph, and something down there is not just resisting, it's trying to lay back down.
Not every giant takes the bait. Some rise, sniff the metal-tasting scent in the water, and settle again, ignoring the line like a piece of drift.
The giant tries one last trick, going broad and low, turning itself into a living barn door pressed against stone and sand.
450.
Eventually, even a 5-ton halibut must choose. Stay pinned until something breaks. The surface gives away the tension, the ship itself leaning in acknowledgement of the weight rising up its invisible ladder.
Once clear of the ground, the halibut becomes less anchor and more unwilling parachute, its flat body catching every upward tug.
The crew shifts from routine to ready stance. Tools for giants laid out. A sling big enough to cradle a car. Hooks
Closer to air and light, its camouflage becomes clearer. Patterns meant for sand, now outlined in a blue it never meant to visit.
They ready themselves where steel meets sea, knowing that when the halibut shows fully, they'll have only seconds to control that bulk. From beneath, it looks like the seafloor itself has decided to float up and confront the hull, eyes the size of dinner plates staring at steel.
Hull start turns the invisible into impact. 5 tons of flatfish launching half its body out of the sea in a single, angry roll.
It tries to pin itself against the gear, jaws grinding so hard on the buried hook that its own gums start to bleed into the sea. They work within arm's reach of that moving slab, using steel poles to steer its edges like men handling a wildly swinging door.
Up close, the mouth looks less like a fish's and more like a trapdoor. Heavy, bone-edged lips slamming shut around the metal they can't shake.
They have only a heartbeat to drop the loop where tail becomes spine,
catching the very hinge of all that power.
Once the tail is tethered, the halibut's strongest muscle answers to a new master, each kick turned into lift instead of escape.
The crane takes on the weight inch by inch, trading seafloor drag for pure gravity, while the drum becomes a mere guide.
Out of the water, its size becomes undeniable. A living shield big enough to cover a truck, writhing in midair. For a moment, the sky disappears behind pale flesh, gravity and momentum arguing over where 5 tons of fish will fall.
When it finally hits steel, it does it the way it does everything, broadside, using all that area to hammer the deck at once.
They pin corners and edges until the giant can't slide, leaving the hook where it is for now, deep in flesh too thick to be rushed.
Elsewhere on the same line, another seafloor slab is being persuaded upward, abandoning the only terrain it has ever trusted.
There's no time to admire their work. Once one giant is aboard, the others still coming up demand the same focus, the same respect.
Soon there are 2 walls in the air, dripping and swinging in tandem, making the deck feel narrower with every centimeter they rise. Laid side by side, the giants turn the deck into a maze of slick flesh and straps, where each step must be chosen.
Even out of the water, the eye gives little away. Just a steady, sideways look, like it's...
The next giant carries old battles on its back, and a new one at the corner of its mouth, blood drawing a delicate red line in the water behind it.
Every impact it makes writes another wet signature across the deck, a reminder of how much force lives inside that broad frame. By the third giant, fatigue and risk both climb, their muscles burning while the fish's own strength still feels endless.
With the third slab in place, the deck feels almost paved in living stone, every impact throwing fresh waves of color up the ship's sides.
When several 5-ton slabs decide to move at once, the deck becomes a shifting maze, one bad step away from being pressed flat between flesh and steel.
Even their fins break tools, not just hooks. Anything let loose on deck is one thrash away from becoming shrapnel. Straps and knots stop the worst of it, but sheer mass still finds ways to shift, smearing men and metal in the process.
What looks like chaos on deck becomes just a faint blush in the water below. Evidence of a battle the sea will erase within hours. The hook sits deep, not shredding, just holding, every tiny movement writing a new red line over old scars.
They use leverage instead of brute force, rolling steel out of flesh before it tears something too badly to keep.
Wood doesn't mean much to 5 tons of angry muscle, and anything not welded or chained is just something it hasn't broken yet.
They bring in the sleds, rolling platforms built not for cargo pallets, but for living seafloor monuments.
The cradle catches the slab's weight, turning 5 tons of unpredictable muscle into something that can be pushed instead of just endured.
Straps sink in like deep fingerprints, not enough to crush the life out, just enough to pin the anger down.
They push the giants like cargo, leaving wet silhouettes behind, shapes that mark where seafloor once lay on steel.
Its back wears a history of survival. Old attacks from predators that never quite managed to turn this slab into a meal.
By the time the cradles lock in, the worst of the chaos is contained. 3 seafloor titan longline.
They start turning slabs into statistics, length, width, tail span, numbers that put the weight they felt into ink.
Tag ID verified, KJ783MP4. One quick punch and each had a code of its own, a way to be more than just the huge one on the left.
Photos back up the numbers, angles and timestamps that will matter long after the deck has forgotten their shapes.
Back on the bottom, all that remains are halibut-shaped hollows, footprints the sea will smooth out in a few tides.
When the weight finally settles on the display, it confirms what their spines already told them. These slabs are measured in tons, not guesses.
Even half spent, 5 tons finding a second wind can undo a man's footing faster than he can think.
When brute strength won't settle, they lean on chemistry, doses calculated to calm giants without wasting them. They clean the wounds they caused, not out of mercy, but to keep rot and contamination from wasting what they risked so much to lift.
Outside the hull, the ocean is already forgetting, smearing away the trail of blood into another anonymous patch of open water. Once the gear is squared away, the giants become the main cargo, fixed in place and logged like any other heavy load. Rules written in ink restate lessons once carved in bruises and broken bones, reminders that mass kills even when teeth never touch skin. They wash themselves back to neutral, scrubbing away shark and halibut prints so the next shift won't carry the last fight on their clothes. Tiny mouths finish what hoses and drains began, wiping the last taste of giant halibut from the steel before the ship moves on.
With the giants secured and the worst of the mess under control, the ship shifts from catching to handling.
Pins and steel decide what weight goes where. Tiny cylinders of metal holding back tons of shifting force. The slabs roll toward the ship's cold heart, where their heat will finally drain away completely into steel and refrigerant.
Below deck, gravity and rail guides do the job the crane started, bringing giants into a space built just for weight and cold. Each halibut gets its own slot, a numbered berth where it will ride out the rest of the voyage without sliding or slamming. Numbers down here matter as much as they did on the deck. Too warm and the catch spoils, too cold and it freezes rough, ruining texture. Once the final sled is locked, the hold becomes a vault of seafloor, giant outlines resting in a man-made winter.
A turn of handles, and the giants vanish from sight, their world reduced to numbers on a manifest and weight in a ship's trim.
On paper and glass, the trip becomes lines and columns, positions, weights, and codes, turning wet labor into data. Behind the ship, only scars and sand and a few scattered hooks remain, small reminders for a world that rarely sees sunlight.
Port brings a new kind of steel into the picture. Towering cranes and chilled boxes waiting to swallow the weight the ship carried in its belly.
One steel system hands off to another, giants trading ship rails for shore carts without ever touching bare concrete. Seals and signatures close the loop, drawing a legal line from the seafloor's hidden slabs to whatever table they eventually reach.
Before blade or ice, they rinse the journey off, washing away the night's sand, blood, and exhaust from the halibut's skin.
They scan the slab like a landscape, cameras and lasers mapping every rise, dent, and scar for records and research.
Weight here must match weight out there. Any difference accounted for in water, ice, and loss, not guesswork.
From this point on, the sled beneath it matters more than the ship that carried it, and this frame will be its path into knives and notebooks.
From open air to steel corridors, the halibut crosses another threshold, leaving ships and cranes behind for knives, scales, and stoves.
Inside, the environment shifts, but the rules don't. Everything that touches the slab is counted, checked, and approved.
The first cut is slow and decisive, following muscle and bone instead of fighting them, trading brute force for controlled separation. Out of the hide and bone come slabs of clean flesh, bright and firm, separated from the darker muscle that did most of the work in life.
What was once a 5-ton sheet becomes dozens of portions, each traceable back to one patch of seafloor on one particular night.
In this quieter room, the story condenses. Hours of steel and strain turned into a brief pre-service speech and a label on a tray.
On heat, the flesh finally changes state, giving up its moisture and fat in controlled amounts instead of in violent sprays.
Each plate carries a quiet caption: where the fish lay, when it was lifted, how long it traveled to reach this exact spot under this exact light.
For the diners, the halibut is texture and taste, not weight. A thing that flakes under a fork instead of heaving against steel.
A single bite holds the ghost of the original size, a reminder that this small, delicate piece once belonged to something the size of a truck bed.
He speaks of cranes, cold, and risk, condensing an entire crew's labor into a few sentences between courses.
Far from the polished plates, the ship resets, hoses, welds, and lines ready for the next time the crew is told to go where the bottom lives.
From hidden hollows in the seafloor to the open plates of a city, the journey of giant halibut begins and ends with this steel hull.